Martin Fletcher had despised dogs for as long as he could remember. To him, they were messy, loud, and nothing but trouble. But everything changed one cold morning when he stumbled upon a small, injured puppy lying in the ditch along the edge of his farm. The sight was unexpected and unsettling. For someone who had spent his life shooing dogs away, what he did next left everyone who knew him utterly shocked. The puppy was barely moving, its tiny frame trembling in the damp grass. A soft whimper broke the silence, pulling at something deep inside Martin he didn't know he had. He stood there, torn between walking away and doing something entirely out of character. His neighbors often joked that Martin had a heart as hard as the rocky soil of his fields. But in that moment, something shifted. The next few moments would define not only Martin's life, but also the fate of this helpless creature. What could have driven a man so closed off to extend a hand of compassion? And why did this single act of kindness spark a journey no one could have anticipated? Stay with us as we unravel the extraordinary story of Martin and his unexpected bond with an injured puppy. Martin Fletcher had spent his 62 years in the same small rural town, surrounded by sprawling fields, rickety fences, and an old farmhouse that had weathered decades of storms. He was a man of routine and solitude, waking before dawn to tend to his crops and retiring with the sunset. The townsfolk knew him as gruff and aloof, and no one dared to let their dogs wander near his property. He had a reputation for chasing them off with curses and claps of his hands, but that morning was different. The frost had melted just enough to create a thin sheen of dew on the ground. Martin trudged along the dirt road, hands tucked into his worn coat, when he saw it, a small, motionless lump near the edge of the road. At first, he thought it was a piece of debris or a discarded coat, but as he got closer, his steps slowed, and he realized it was a puppy. The little creature was curled tightly, its black and white fur matted with mud. Its left paw was twisted at an odd angle, and there was a faint but steady rise and fall of its tiny chest. Martin hesitated, his hand hovering in the air as if unsure whether to shoo it away or pick it up. His gut reaction screamed to leave it be. Dogs had always been a nuisance to him, barking at night, digging up gardens, or chasing livestock. Yet, something about the way the puppy shivered struck a nerve he didn't know he had. "Stupid mutt," he muttered under his breath, but his boots stayed planted. Finally, with a sigh of exasperation, Martin shrugged off his coat, wrapped the puppy gently, and cradled it close to his chest. The creature let out a weak yelp, but didn't resist. He carried the puppy back to his farmhouse, each step feeling heavier than the last. Martin hadn't interacted with animals beyond the occasional stray cow, and the idea of taking in a dog, an animal he'd sworn off for decades, felt absurd. Yet, as he crossed the threshold of his home, he found himself whispering, "Let's see what I can do for you." Once inside, Martin laid the puppy on an old blanket near the fireplace. He filled a bowl with warm water and grabbed an old tin of biscuits from the pantry, crumbling one into tiny pieces. The puppy sniffed weakly at the offering but didn't move. Its eyes, however, opened briefly, meeting Martin's gaze. For a moment, the room felt unnaturally quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The day wore on, and Martin struggled with what to do next. He wasn't a vet or a dog lover, and the nearest animal clinic was miles away, too far for his rusty truck to manage. So, he did the only thing he could think of. He called Clara, his neighbor down the road. Clara was known for her soft spot for animals, and Martin hoped she could offer some advice without prying too much into his sudden change of heart. When Clara arrived, she stepped inside and gasped, "You, with a dog? Martin, this is a miracle in itself." "Don't start," Martin grumbled, motioning her toward the puppy. "Just tell me what to do." Clara knelt beside the pup, inspecting its paw and gently stroking its head. "It's dehydrated and malnourished, but I think it'll pull through if you're willing to put in the effort." Martin frowned. "Effort?" Clara smirked. "Yes, Martin, feeding it, cleaning it, making sure it doesn't get worse. It's not going to heal on its own." The words hung in the air as Martin stared at the little creature, its tiny frame rising and falling with labored breaths. He felt a strange pang of responsibility, as though the puppy's survival depended entirely on him. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll do what I can." For the next few days, Martin's life took a surprising turn. He followed Clara's instructions, feeding the puppy soft food, cleaning its wound and keeping it warm. The first time the pup managed to stand, its wobbling legs barely supporting it, Martin couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride. He hadn't realized how invested he'd become until that moment, but taking care of the dog wasn't without its challenges. His friends at the general store teased him relentlessly when they found out, and Martin's gruff exterior did little to dissuade their jokes. "Looks like Fletcher's gone soft," one man chuckled. "Maybe we should start calling you Dog Dad." Martin brushed off the comments, but inside, he felt a mixture of embarrassment and stubborn resolve. He hadn't planned to become attached, yet every time the puppy curled up near the fire or wagged its tiny tail at him, he felt his heart soften just a little more. As the days turned into weeks, the puppy, now named Scout, after a nickname Martin's father used to call him, began to thrive. Its once weak and fragile frame filled out, and the black and white fur became soft and shiny under Martin's care. Scout followed him everywhere, limping slightly on his injured paw but determined not to be left behind. Whether Martin was tending the crops, fixing fences, or hauling firewood, the pup was always close, wagging its tail and yipping at his heels. Martin found himself smiling more than he cared to admit. He'd never imagined himself the kind of man who would talk to a dog, but here he was, muttering about the weather or grumbling about his bad knee, while Scout stared up at him, as if he understood every word. It was a peculiar kind of companionship, quiet, loyal, and completely unexpected. But not everyone was as enamored with Scout. One afternoon, as Martin loaded sacks of grain into his truck, Clyde, his longtime neighbor and occasional drinking buddy, pulled up in his own battered vehicle. Clyde climbed out, his broad frame casting a shadow across the truck bed, and eyed Scout with disdain. "Well, I'll be," Clyde said, crossing his arms. "Didn't think I'd live to see the day Martin Fletcher kept a mutt on his property." Martin bristled. "He's not a mutt. His name's Scout." "Scout, huh?" Clyde chuckled, shaking his head. "Never thought you'd fall for one of them flea-bitten strays. What's gotten into you, Martin?" Martin's jaw tightened. "None of your business." But Clyde wasn't finished. "You know dogs like him don't belong on a farm. They're more trouble than they're worth. Mark my words, that thing's gonna turn on you one day. You'll regret keeping him around." Scout, sensing the tension, let out a small bark and moved closer to Martin's side. Martin reached down, resting a protective hand on the dog's head. "He's not going anywhere," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Clyde shrugged, smirking as he climbed back into his truck. "Suit yourself, but don't say I didn't warn you." As Clyde drove off, Martin felt a flicker of doubt creep into his mind. He'd spent years keeping animals off his land, convinced they were nothing but trouble. And yet here was Scout, this tiny, energetic pup who had somehow wormed his way into Martin's life. Was Clyde right? Was Martin making a mistake by keeping him? Later that evening, as Martin sat by the fire with Scout curled up at his feet, he couldn't shake Clyde's words. The puppy was growing stronger every day, but the memory of finding him injured and helpless still lingered. What if Clyde was right? What if keeping Scout was more trouble than it was worth? But then Scout shifted, resting his head on Martin's boot and letting out a contented sigh. The simple gesture tugged at something deep inside Martin, and he realized that Clyde didn't know what he was talking about. Scout wasn't just some stray dog, he was family now, and Martin wasn't about to give up on him. Over the next few days, Martin threw himself into farm work, Scout always by his side. Together, they repaired fences, cleared brush, and even ventured into town for supplies. The townsfolk, still skeptical of Martin's new companion, watched with curiosity as the old farmer carried a sack of feed in one hand and a bag of dog treats in the other. One afternoon, as Martin and Scout worked in the fields, a sudden storm rolled in. The sky darkened, and the wind howled through the trees. Rain began to pour in heavy sheets, turning the dirt into thick mud. Martin hurried to gather his tools and head back to the farmhouse, but Scout had other plans. The pup had caught sight of something in the distance, a faint movement near the edge of the property. Despite Martin's calls, Scout darted off, his small frame disappearing into the downpour. Panic surged through Martin as he chased after the dog, his boots slipping in the mud. "Scout, get back here!" Martin shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. He finally reached the edge of the field, his breath coming in ragged gasps. There, huddled under a tree, was Scout, his body soaked and trembling but fiercely guarding what appeared to be another dog. This one was larger, with matted fur and a limp, its eyes wide with fear. Martin hesitated, his mind racing. Another stray. His instinct was to turn around and leave it to fend for itself, just as he would have done before Scout came into his life. But then he saw the way Scout nudged the injured dog, his tail wagging as if to say, "We can't leave it here." With a sigh, Martin removed his coat and wrapped it around the larger dog, just as he had done for Scout weeks earlier. "You're going to be the death of me," he muttered, scooping up the stray and trudging back toward the farmhouse, Scout trotting proudly at his side. The storm raged on as Martin carried the larger dog into his farmhouse, Scout trailing close behind. Rainwater pooled on the wooden floor as Martin set the injured dog down on an old quilt in front of the fireplace. He quickly stoked the fire, its warmth filling the room as the two dogs began to shiver less. Martin grabbed a clean towel and crouched beside the stranger. The larger dog was a mix of tans and whites, with patches of mud caked onto its fur. Its eyes were a piercing golden hue, filled with exhaustion and wariness. As Martin gently wiped the mud away, he noticed something unusual. Its front paw bore a jagged scar, a sign of an old injury that had healed poorly. The sight tugged at something in Martin's memory, but he couldn't quite place it. Scout, meanwhile, sniffed at the newcomer with curiosity, wagging his tail as if to reassure the larger dog. Martin couldn't help but smile at Scout's excitement. "You're a real social butterfly, aren't you?" he muttered, scratching behind Scout's ears. The larger dog, sensing no threat, relaxed slightly but still whimpered when Martin examined its back leg. "Easy there," Martin murmured, his voice softer than he expected. He ran his hands along the limb, frowning when he felt the unmistakable swelling of a sprain or fracture. The storm outside showed no sign of letting up, and Martin knew he couldn't take the dog to the vet until the next day. "Looks like you're stuck with me for the night," he said, rising to his feet and heading to the kitchen. He filled a bowl with water and brought it back, setting it down beside the larger dog, who hesitated before lapping it up greedily. As the storm began to subside, Martin sat in his worn armchair, Scout curled up at his feet. The larger dog, now dozing fitfully by the fire, emitted occasional soft whines, as though haunted by whatever had brought it to this state. Martin leaned back, his mind racing with questions. Where had the dog come from? Was it another stray? Or had someone abandoned it? As if reading his thoughts, Scout stirred and rested his head on Martin's knee. The simple act grounded Martin, reminding him of how far they'd come since the day he found Scout. He glanced back at the larger dog, who now seemed to be resting more peacefully. The next morning, the sun broke through the storm clouds, casting a golden glow over the farmhouse. Martin loaded both dogs into his truck, carefully lifting the injured one into the back seat. Scout hopped in eagerly, curling up beside the larger dog as if to keep it company. The drive to the vet was uneventful, save for Scout's occasional yips of encouragement. Martin chuckled to himself. "You're quite the caretaker, aren't you?" At the clinic, the veterinarian, Dr. Harper, greeted Martin with a mixture of surprise and amusement. "Martin Fletcher with not one but two dogs. Never thought I'd see the day." "Don't start," Martin grumbled, though a faint smile tugged at his lips. "Doctor." Harper examined the larger dog with a practiced hand, her brow furrowing as she inspected the scar on its paw and the injury to its leg. "This isn't your average stray," she said, glancing up at Martin. "This dog's been through a lot. Likely abused or used in illegal fights. That scar's not from an accident." Martin felt a wave of anger rise in his chest. "People like that shouldn't be allowed to have animals," he said, his voice low. Dr. Harper nodded in agreement. "Unfortunately, it happens more than you'd think. The good news is the leg injury isn't too severe. With rest and care, this dog should make a full recovery." As Dr. Harper bandaged the leg and administered a mild sedative, Martin found himself thinking about Scout and how the puppy had changed his perspective. He couldn't turn his back on this dog now, not after everything it had endured. Scout's unwavering loyalty and affection had already softened Martin's heart in ways he hadn't expected. Perhaps there was room for one more. When they returned to the farmhouse, Martin set up a cozy spot for the larger dog near the fireplace. Scout immediately curled up beside it, resting his small head against the larger dog's side. Martin watched the scene unfold, a strange warmth spreading through his chest. "You've got a knack for picking strays," Martin said to Scout, shaking his head. Guess we're in this together now. Later that evening, as Martin sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, he realized the scar on the larger dog's paw reminded him of something he'd seen in an old newspaper article, a story about a dogfighting ring that had been busted in the nearby town of Meadowridge. Could this dog be a survivor from that operation? Martin's thoughts were interrupted by Scout nudging his leg with a stick in his mouth, tail wagging furiously. Laughing, Martin took the stick and threw it across the yard, watching as Scout bounded after it, the larger dog watching curiously from the porch. Despite its ordeal, there was still a spark of life in those golden eyes, a glimmer of hope. For the first time in years, Martin felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just caring for these dogs, they were teaching him something profound about resilience, trust, and the capacity to heal. The farmhouse settled into a new rhythm as Martin adjusted to having 2 dogs under his care. Scout, ever energetic and curious, seemed delighted to have a companion. The larger dog, whom Martin had taken to calling Bailey, was more reserved, often lying quietly by the fire or watching the world through the living room window. Bailey's injuries required constant attention. Martin followed Dr. Harper's instructions meticulously, applying ointments to the scar on Bailey's paw and ensuring the bandages on his leg were changed regularly. At first, Bailey flinched at every touch, his golden eyes wary and untrusting. Martin spoke softly during these moments, his voice steady and calming. "Easy, boy. I'm not going to hurt you." Scout would often sit beside Bailey during these sessions, as if trying to reassure the bigger dog. Their bond was growing stronger, and Martin couldn't help but notice how Bailey seemed to relax when Scout was near. Days turned into weeks, and Bailey's cautious demeanor began to soften. He followed Scout out into the yard, limping slightly but showing a growing curiosity about his surroundings. Martin would watch from the porch, his coffee in hand, as Scout darted around the yard, coaxing Bailey into hesitant games of chase. Though Bailey's movements were slow and deliberate, there was a noticeable lightness in his steps, as though the weight of his past was starting to lift. One crisp autumn morning, Martin decided it was time to take both dogs into town. The trip to Meadowridge was a necessity. Bailey needed follow-up care at the vet, and Martin had errands to run. Loading the dogs into his truck had become a practiced routine, with Scout hopping in eagerly and Bailey needing a little coaxing before settling on the passenger seat. The drive was uneventful, save for the occasional glance from Bailey, who seemed both intrigued and uneasy about the world passing by outside the window. Martin spoke to him as he drove, his voice a mix of reassurance and casual conversation. "Don't worry, Bailey. We're just heading into town. Nothing to be scared of." When they arrived at the vet, Dr. Harper greeted them warmly. She was visibly impressed with Bailey's progress. "You've done a good job, Martin," she said, examining the dog's leg. "The swelling's gone down, and his mobility is improving. He's healing nicely." Martin nodded, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "He's tougher than he looks." As they left the clinic, Martin decided to make a quick stop at the general store. It wasn't a place he frequented often, but he needed supplies for the farm and figured the dogs could handle a short wait in the truck. Scout pressed his nose against the window, his tail wagging furiously at the prospect of new sights and smells, while Bailey lay calmly on the seat, his golden eyes scanning the bustling street. Inside the store, Martin gathered what he needed, exchanging polite nods with the few townsfolk he recognized. Meadowridge was a small town where everyone knew everyone, and it didn't take long for word of Martin's new companions to spread. As he approached the counter, the cashier, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, smiled at him. "I hear you've taken in a couple of strays." Martin shrugged, his gruff demeanor betraying a hint of self-consciousness. "Just doing what needed to be done." "Not everyone would have," she replied, handing him his change. "Those dogs are lucky to have found you." As Martin loaded the supplies into the truck, he noticed a small crowd gathering outside a nearby cafe. Curious, he wandered over, Scout and Bailey in tow. The sight that greeted him stopped him in his tracks, a poster tacked to the cafe's bulletin board featuring a grainy photo of a dog that bore a striking resemblance to Bailey. The headline read, "Help us find them. Survivors of Meadowridge dogfighting ring still missing." Martin's heart sank as he read the details. The article described how several dogs had escaped the ring before authorities could rescue them. Many had been found, but a few, including the one in the photo, remained unaccounted for. "Bailey," Martin whispered, his voice filled with a mix of sorrow and determination. He knelt beside the dog, placing a hand on his head. Bailey tilted his head, his golden eyes meeting Martin's as if sensing the weight of the moment. Returning to the truck, Martin sat in silence for a long moment, his mind racing. He had known Bailey's past was dark, but seeing it laid out so starkly on that poster made it impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a dog in need of care. Bailey was a survivor, carrying scars both visible and unseen. As they drove back to the farm, Martin resolved to do more than just help Bailey heal physically. He would do everything in his power to ensure Bailey felt safe, loved, and free from the shadows of his past. That evening, as the dogs lay by the fire and the farmhouse settled into its usual quiet, Martin picked up the phone. He called Dr. Harper, his voice steady as he spoke. "Doc, I think I need to know more about Bailey's past. If there's a way to track down where he came from, I want to help." Dr. Harper's response was thoughtful. "I'll see what I can find, Martin, but be prepared. It might not be easy." Martin glanced at Bailey, who was dozing peacefully beside Scout. Nothing worth doing ever is. The following morning, Martin woke up earlier than usual. The previous day's discovery about Bailey weighed heavily on his mind. The image from the poster haunted him. Bailey wasn't just any stray. He had endured something unimaginable. Martin's determination to uncover more about Bailey's past grew stronger with each passing hour. After tending to the morning chores, Martin sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his old laptop. He hadn't used the computer in years, but it was time to do some digging. Bailey lay at his feet, Scout snoozing beside him. The farmhouse was quiet, save for the rhythmic tapping of Martin's fingers on the keyboard. Searching for information on the Meadow Ridge dogfighting ring was no easy task. News articles detailed the police raid and the rescue of several dogs, but the details were grim. The conditions described made Martin's stomach turn. Dogs chained and malnourished, forced to fight for survival in a brutal underground operation. The article mentioned a local shelter, Meadow Ridge Animal Sanctuary, which had taken in the rescued dogs. Martin jotted down the phone number, hesitating for a moment before making the call. The line rang a few times before a warm, friendly voice answered. "This is Sarah at Meadow Ridge Animal Sanctuary. How can I help you?" Martin cleared his throat, his voice gruff. Hi. My name's Martin, and I think I've got one of the dogs that escaped from that fighting ring you folks dealt with a while back." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Sarah's tone shifted to one of cautious interest. "Really? Do you have any details you can share?" Martin described Bailey's appearance and the poster he'd seen in town. He explained how he'd found Bailey injured and scared, and how he'd been caring for him ever since. "It sounds like he could be one of them," Sarah said thoughtfully. "If you're comfortable, we'd love for you to bring him in. We could check for any identifying marks or microchips, and we might have records that could help piece together his history." Martin hesitated. The thought of taking Bailey to an unfamiliar place didn't sit well with him, but he knew it was the right thing to do. "All right, I'll bring him by tomorrow." That evening, Martin prepared Bailey for the visit. As he wrapped the bandages around Bailey's leg, he spoke to him softly. "We're gonna figure this out, boy. You've been through a lot, but you're safe now. I'll make sure of it." Scout, as if sensing the gravity of the moment, stayed close, resting his head on Martin's lap. The bond between the two dogs had grown stronger each day, and Scout seemed to take on the role of Bailey's protector, always by his side. The next morning, Martin loaded both dogs into the truck and drove to the Meadow Ridge Animal Sanctuary. The facility was nestled in a quiet stretch of countryside, surrounded by rolling hills and dotted with paddocks for rescued animals. As Martin parked, Bailey sat upright, his golden eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. Scout wagged his tail, seemingly unbothered by the change of scenery. Sarah greeted them at the entrance, her smile warm and welcoming. "You must be Martin," she said, crouching down to greet the dogs. "And this must be Bailey." Bailey backed away slightly, his body tense, but Sarah's gentle demeanor seemed to put him at ease. "He's a beautiful boy," she said softly, extending her hand for him to sniff. Martin nodded, his hand resting on Bailey's back. "He's been through a lot." Inside, Sarah led them to a quiet examination room. A veterinarian joined them, carefully examining Bailey while Sarah reviewed the shelter's records. As the vet scanned Bailey for a microchip, Martin held his breath. "There's no chip," the vet finally said, shaking his head. "But he does have some distinct scars that match the descriptions we have on file." Sarah looked up from her notes. "If he is one of the dogs, we'll do everything we can to help. But Martin, it's up to you if you want to keep him." Martin frowned, his protective instincts kicking in. "What do you mean?" "Well," Sarah said carefully, "some of these dogs are eventually rehomed. Others stay with their rescuers if they're in a safe, loving environment. We don't want to disrupt his progress if he's thriving with you." Martin's expression softened. "He's not going anywhere." Sarah smiled. "That's what I hoped you'd say." Before they left, Sarah handed Martin a packet of information on the rescued dogs. It contained updates on the others, as well as resources for caring for dogs who had been through trauma. "If you ever need help, don't hesitate to reach out," she said. As Martin drove home, his mind churned with questions. He had learned more about Bailey's past, but it felt like only the beginning. Back at the farm, Bailey and Scout trotted into the yard, their tails wagging. Martin watched them for a moment, his heart heavy with a mix of gratitude and sadness. Later that night, as the dogs lay curled up by the fire, Martin flipped through the packet Sarah had given him. One story stood out: a dog named Luna, who had been adopted by a family after being rescued from the same ring. The report detailed her recovery and the challenges she faced, but it also spoke of her resilience and the love she brought to her new home. Martin looked over at Bailey, his scars barely visible in the warm glow of the firelight. "We'll get there," he said softly. One step at a time. The following days at the farm brought an unusual quiet to Martin's routine. While Scout continued to bound through the fields with his characteristic energy, Bailey's behavior seemed to shift. Though the once cautious pup had grown more relaxed around Martin and Scout, he now appeared restless. At times, he would sit by the window, his golden eyes fixed on some distant point, ears twitching at faint noises only he could hear. Martin noticed these changes and couldn't shake the feeling that Bailey was grappling with something unresolved. The visit to the sanctuary had brought clarity to Bailey's past, but it had also unearthed new questions. What memories lingered in Bailey's mind? Did he remember the people who had hurt him, or the dogs who had shared his suffering? One morning, Martin decided it was time to push past his hesitation. "Bailey," he said, kneeling down beside the dog, "you've been through a lot. I don't know what's going on in that head of yours, but we're going to figure this out, together." Bailey leaned into Martin's touch, his tail wagging faintly. Scout, sensing the serious tone of the moment, sidled up beside them, pressing his nose against Bailey's side in a show of solidarity. The gesture wasn't lost on Martin. "That settles it," Martin muttered. "We're taking this one step further." That afternoon, Martin made a call to Sarah at the sanctuary. He wanted to know if there were any updates about the dogs rescued alongside Bailey. Sarah's voice was both warm and cautious as she answered, "Actually, Martin, there is something. A few of the other dogs have been placed with foster families, and some are being trained to adjust to normal lives. But one of the rescues, a younger female named Daisy, hasn't been thriving. She's incredibly timid and hasn't bonded with anyone yet." Martin frowned. "What are you saying?" "Well," Sarah continued hesitantly, "sometimes dogs from these situations respond better when they're reunited with others who shared their experience. It's not always possible, but if you're open to it, we could try introducing Daisy to Bailey. It might help her, and it could bring Bailey some closure too." Martin stared out at the field where Bailey and Scout played, his heart weighing the decision. Bringing another traumatized dog into his home was a risk. He didn't know how Scout would react, or if Bailey could handle the emotions of such a reunion, but the idea of giving Daisy a chance at healing struck a chord in him. "Let's try it," he said firmly. "When can I bring him by?" A week later, Martin and Bailey were back at Meadow Ridge Animal Sanctuary. The meeting was arranged in a quiet outdoor pen, with plenty of space for both dogs to feel comfortable. Bailey's demeanor was unusually calm as they waited, his gaze fixed on the door. When Sarah brought Daisy out, the small, wiry dog trembled visibly. Her coat was patchy, and her ears drooped low as she avoided eye contact with the humans. But the moment Bailey saw her, his tail began to wag, tentatively at first, then more confidently. Daisy froze, her wide eyes locking onto Bailey. For a long moment, neither dog moved. Then, slowly, Bailey took a step forward, his body language gentle and inviting. Daisy sniffed the air, her tail tucked tightly between her legs. When Bailey reached her, he crouched slightly, lowering himself to her level in a gesture of reassurance. To everyone's surprise, Daisy took a hesitant step forward, pressing her nose to Bailey's. The two stood nose to nose for what felt like an eternity, their quiet exchange speaking volumes. Martin could feel the lump in his throat as he watched them, two souls who had endured so much, finding solace in each other's presence. Over the next hour, the two dogs became inseparable. Daisy followed Bailey's lead, mimicking his movements and gaining confidence as he showed her the safety of the pen. By the end of their session, Sarah was smiling. "This is incredible," she said. "I've never seen Daisy warm up to another dog or anyone this quickly. It's like Bailey's giving her permission to trust again." Martin nodded, his own emotions threatening to spill over. "Looks like Bailey's got a new job," he said with a small smile. "What's the next step?" "If you're willing, we'd love to see how Daisy does at your place," Sarah said. "No pressure, but it might be just what she needs." Back at the farm, the adjustment was gradual but heartwarming. Scout, after an initial bout of curiosity, accepted Daisy into their pack with surprising ease. Bailey, now a mentor in his own right, guided Daisy through the routines of farm life. He showed her the best spots to nap under the oak tree and even encouraged her to play, a milestone that brought tears to Martin's eyes the first time he saw it. Martin, too, found himself transformed by Daisy's presence. Caring for two dogs with such deep emotional scars challenged him in ways he hadn't anticipated. But it also taught him the power of patience and unconditional love. One evening, as the dogs lay curled up by the fire, Martin reflected on how far they had come. He reached down to scratch Bailey behind the ears, then gently patted Daisy's side. "You two," he said softly, "are teaching this old man a thing or two about life." As life on the farm began to settle into a new rhythm with Daisy's arrival, an undercurrent of tension began to ripple through the tranquility. While Daisy and Bailey grew closer with each passing day, Scout seemed increasingly aloof. The normally boisterous dog, who had welcomed Daisy so readily, now spent more time observing from a distance, his head cocked as if pondering something only he understood. Martin noticed the shift almost immediately. At first, he thought Scout might be jealous of the attention Daisy was receiving, but the dog's behavior suggested something deeper. Scout wasn't acting out or avoiding the pack. He was watching as though he sensed something Martin couldn't see. One particularly cold morning, Martin stepped outside with his coffee, the frost-covered grass crunching under his boots. He found Scout sitting at the edge of the field, his gaze fixed on the woods that bordered the farm. Bailey and Daisy were playing nearby, their joyful barks echoing through the crisp air. But Scout didn't so much as glance in their direction. "What's out there, buddy?" Martin asked, kneeling beside him. Scout didn't respond, his focus unwavering. The woods had always been a familiar backdrop to the farm, a place where Martin would occasionally walk to clear his head or collect firewood. But now, looking at the dense trees through Scout's eyes, they seemed different, ominous almost. That evening, as Martin sat by the fire with the dogs curled up at his feet, he decided to investigate. The notion felt silly. There was nothing in the woods he hadn't seen before, but the unease in Scout's demeanor was infectious. If nothing else, it would put his mind at ease. The following morning, after breakfast, Martin grabbed his jacket, a flashlight, and his walking stick. "Scout, you're coming with me," he called, and the dog immediately perked up, trotting to his side. Bailey and Daisy watched from the porch, their heads tilted in curiosity. The woods were still and silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Martin's boots crunched against the ground, the sound amplified in the quiet. Scout stayed close, his ears swiveling at every noise. As they walked deeper into the woods, Martin felt the familiar paths give way to uneven terrain. He hadn't ventured this far in years. Just as he was about to turn back, Scout stopped abruptly, his body rigid. A low growl rumbled in his throat. "Easy, boy," Martin murmured, shining his flashlight ahead. The beam illuminated a patch of earth that had been disturbed, dirt scattered as though something had been digging there. Martin knelt to inspect it. The area was littered with faint tracks, too indistinct to identify clearly. He spotted a few scraps of fabric caught on the underbrush nearby. His heart quickened. "Scout, let's head back," he said, his voice steady but firm. Scout didn't move, his gaze locked on something in the distance. Martin followed the dog's line of sight, his flashlight revealing a shadowy figure darting between the trees. It was too fast to make out, but it was unmistakably there. His stomach churned with a mix of fear and curiosity. "All right, let's go," Martin urged, tugging gently at Scout's collar. Reluctantly, the dog obeyed, and they retraced their steps toward the farm. Back at the house, Martin couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. He replayed the moment in his mind. The tracks, the fabric, the figure. It wasn't unusual for the woods to attract wildlife, but this felt different. Someone, or something, had been there. He decided to call Sarah, explaining what he had found. "Do you think it could have something to do with Bailey or Daisy?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Sarah was quiet for a moment. "It's possible," she admitted. "The dogs we rescued were part of a larger operation. We couldn't save all of them, and we don't know what happened to the others. It's not unheard of for people involved in illegal activities to come looking for animals they've lost." The thought sent a shiver down Martin's spine. He glanced at Bailey and Daisy, who were now dozing peacefully by the fire, unaware of the potential danger lurking just beyond the farm. "What should I do?" he asked. "Keep an eye out," Sarah advised. "If you see anything suspicious, call the authorities immediately. And Martin, don't take any chances." Over the next few days, Martin kept a close watch on the woods. Scout seemed more vigilant than ever, often stationing himself near the edge of the property as if standing guard. Bailey and Daisy remained blissfully unaware, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. One night, as Martin was locking up the barn, he heard a noise, a faint rustling from the direction of the woods. He froze, his hand tightening around the latch. Scout appeared at his side, his growl low and menacing. Martin strained his ears, his heart pounding. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't the wind or an animal, it was deliberate. He stepped toward the house, urging Scout to follow. As they reached the porch, Martin glanced back at the woods. For a moment, he thought he saw a pair of eyes reflecting in the darkness. The unease that had been simmering beneath the surface now boiled over. Whatever, or whoever, was out there wasn't going away. Martin knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. The unease hanging over Martin's farm had become a shadow in his otherwise peaceful routine. Daisy and Bailey continued to thrive, their playful bond growing stronger. But Scout's watchful demeanor set Martin on edge. It was as though Scout understood something that Martin couldn't quite grasp, and the incident in the woods weighed heavily on his mind. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Martin decided to enlist help. He called Sarah, explaining the strange happenings in greater detail, including the tracks, the fabric, and the fleeting figure he had seen. "Do you think someone could be after the dogs?" Martin asked, his voice tight with concern. Sarah sighed on the other end of the line. "It's possible, Martin. We've had cases where people involved in illegal breeding or fighting rings tried to recover their animals. Daisy might have been part of something larger. You said she was found abandoned, but that doesn't mean she wasn't being watched." The thought sent a chill down Martin's spine. He glanced out the window at the dogs, who were playing in the yard, blissfully unaware of the potential threat looming over them. "What do I do, Sarah?" "I don't want to let anything happen to them," Martin said. "First, document everything. Take photos of the tracks and the fabric. If you see anyone near your property, call the authorities. I'll also reach out to my contacts and see if anyone else has reported unusual activity," Sarah said firmly. Over the next few days, Martin began to notice other subtle signs of intrusion. His usually pristine farmyard had a disturbed patch of soil near the edge of the woods, and one of his storage sheds had been left slightly ajar, though nothing seemed to be missing. Scout's vigilance grew even sharper, and he refused to leave Martin's side for long. Despite the tension, Daisy and Bailey provided a much-needed distraction. Their antics were a source of constant joy, and Martin found himself smiling more often than he had in years. Daisy had a knack for sneaking into the kitchen when Martin wasn't looking, always emerging with something in her mouth, a roll, a sock, or once, even a spatula. Bailey, ever the gentle soul, would chase her playfully, barking his protest. One evening, as Martin watched the two dogs tussle in the living room, he couldn't help but marvel at how much they had changed his life. Daisy's boundless energy had reignited a spark of purpose, while Bailey's steadfast loyalty reminded Martin of the importance of trust and connection. "You two sure know how to keep me on my toes," Martin said, chuckling as Daisy triumphantly claimed a piece of rope from Bailey. Scout, lying near the door, thumped his tail once but kept his gaze fixed on the window. As the days passed, Martin's vigilance increased. He set up makeshift barriers along the property's edge, using logs and old fencing to block easy access from the woods. He also started carrying a flashlight and his walking stick whenever he went outside after dark, just in case. One afternoon, Martin decided to take a proactive step. He drove into town to visit the local sheriff's office, bringing along the photos he had taken of the tracks and the fabric. Sheriff Daniels, a burly man with a no-nonsense demeanor, listened intently as Martin recounted the events. "This doesn't look like random wildlife activity," Daniels said, studying the photos. "Tracks like these don't belong to any animal around here, and the fabric, it could be from someone's clothing." "Do you think someone's been on my property?" Martin asked, his stomach twisting. "It's possible," Daniels admitted. "We've had a few reports of suspicious activity in the area, but nothing concrete. I'll send a deputy out to patrol near your farm for the next few nights, just in case." Martin nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and unease. He appreciated the extra security, but the idea that someone might be targeting his home left him unsettled. That night, as the dog settled in for bed, Martin stood at the window, staring out into the darkness. The moonlight cast eerie shadows across the fields, and the woods beyond seemed impenetrable, a black wall of mystery. Scout lay at his feet, his ears twitching at every sound. Bailey and Daisy were curled up together on their shared bed, their soft snores a comforting rhythm. Martin's thoughts wandered to Daisy's past. Who had abandoned her? Why had she been left in such a vulnerable state? And could that same person, or someone connected to them, be the source of the disturbances? As he stood there, lost in thought, Scout suddenly rose to his feet, his tail stiff and his ears perked. A low growl rumbled in his throat. "What is it, boy?" Martin whispered, his pulse quickening. Scout moved to the door, his nose pressed against the crack. A moment later, Martin heard it. A faint sound like twigs snapping underfoot. It came from the direction of the woods. Martin grabbed his flashlight and walking stick, his heart pounding. "Stay here," he told the other dogs, though he doubted they understood. Scout was already at his side, ready to follow. As Martin stepped onto the porch, the cool night air wrapped around him like a shroud. The sound came again, closer this time. He shone the flashlight toward the woods, the beam cutting through the darkness. For a moment he saw nothing. Then, just at the edge of the trees, a shadow moved. Too large to be an animal, too quick to be a trick of the light. Martin's grip on the stick tightened. Whatever, or whoever, was out there. They weren't welcome. Martin's heart pounded as the shadow moved again, this time disappearing deeper into the woods. He stood on the porch, frozen for a moment, debating his next move. Scout remained at his side, his growls low and insistent. "Stay sharp, boy," Martin whispered, gripping his walking stick tightly. He stepped off the porch, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the night. The air was cold, heavy with an unsettling silence that made each crunch of his boots on the gravel feel deafening. He advanced slowly toward the edge of the woods, Scout keeping pace with him. The other dogs remained behind, their eyes following Martin's every move through the living room window. The trail of snapped twigs led Martin deeper into the forest than he had been in years. The once familiar path seemed alien in the dark, overgrown and twisted by time. Scout sniffed the air, his body tense and alert, ready for anything. "Who's out there?" Martin called, his voice steady but loud enough to echo through the trees. No answer came, but the sound of movement, this time deliberate and unhurried, returned from his left. Martin swung the flashlight toward the noise, catching a brief glimpse of a figure retreating further into the woods. The man wore a dark jacket, his face obscured by shadows. Martin's stomach twisted with fear, but his anger burned brighter. "Hey, you've got no business here," Martin shouted, taking a step forward. The figure stopped but didn't turn around. Scout barked sharply, and the man bolted, crashing through the underbrush with reckless speed. Without thinking, Martin gave chase, his stick in one hand, flashlight in the other. His years of labor on the farm had kept him strong, but his age betrayed him. His legs ached and his breathing grew heavy as the pursuit stretched on. The chase ended abruptly when Martin stumbled into a small clearing. The man was gone, but something else caught his attention. a crudely constructed camp hidden among the trees. There were remnants of a fire pit, empty cans, and a torn sleeping bag. More chillingly, a few pieces of rope and a rusted cage large enough to hold a dog sat in the shadows. Scout sniffed around the campsite, growling at the cage. Martin's gut churned as he pieced the clues together. Whoever had been trespassing wasn't just wandering aimlessly. They had been watching, waiting, and possibly planning something far worse. He snapped a few photos of the site with his phone, his hands shaking. The evidence needed to be reported, and soon. As he turned to leave, Scout let out a sharp bark, standing stiffly near the edge of the clearing. Martin followed his gaze and spotted something half buried under leaves. A collar. He picked it up, his heart sinking at the sight. It was worn, frayed, and too small for Daisy or Bailey. Was this from another dog? One that hadn't been so lucky? Martin hurried back to the farm, Scout leading the way. Every step through the woods felt heavier than the last, the weight of what he had seen pressing down on him. The safety of Daisy, Bailey, and even Scout now felt precarious. When he reached the house, he bolted the door and called the sheriff. Sheriff Daniels answered quickly, his voice calm but serious as Martin relayed what he had found. "We'll send someone out immediately," Daniels said. "Stay inside, Martin. Lock your doors and keep the dogs close. This doesn't sound like something we can ignore." Martin hung up, his chest tight with a mix of fear and determination. He turned to find all three dogs watching him intently. Daisy tilted her head, her tail wagging slightly as if to comfort him. Bailey pressed his nose against Martin's leg, and Scout, ever the protector, sat by the door, his eyes sharp and unyielding. "Scout, we'll get through this," Martin said aloud, though the words were more for himself than for the dogs. Together, the sheriff's deputies arrived within the hour, combing through the woods with flashlights and protective gear. Martin showed them the photos he had taken and guided them to the campsite. Sheriff Daniels inspected the area, his expression grim as he examined the cage and the makeshift camp. "This isn't just trespassing," Daniels said. "Whoever this is, they've got a plan. And it's not a good one." Martin swallowed hard, his resolve hardening. "What do we do now?" "We're going to monitor your property closely. We'll also investigate this site and see if it connects to any reported cases of animal trafficking or abuse," Daniels replied. "In the meantime, you need to be vigilant. Don't leave the dogs unattended, even for a moment." That night, Martin couldn't sleep. He sat in the living room, the shotgun he hadn't touched in years resting across his lap. Scout lay at his feet, his ears twitching at every creak of the house. Daisy and Bailey were curled up together on the couch, their breathing slow and peaceful. The thought of losing them, any of them, was unbearable. These dogs had become more than just animals to him. They were family. And if someone was intent on harming them, they would have to go through him first. As the hours dragged on, Martin's mind raced. Who was the man in the woods? Was he acting alone, or was there a larger operation behind him? And why had he targeted Martin's farm? The answers felt maddeningly out of reach, but one thing was clear: this wasn't over. The morning broke with an eerie stillness over Martin's farm. The usual chorus of birdsong was muted, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Martin rose from the couch where he had spent a restless night, the shotgun still by his side. Scout stretched and yawned, his tail wagging briefly before his sharp gaze turned toward the window. Martin fed the dogs as usual, but the tension in the air made even their carefree enthusiasm feel subdued. He double-checked the locks on the doors and windows before stepping outside. He wanted to assess the farm's perimeter and ensure there were no signs of further trespassing. Daisy and Bailey stayed behind, but Scout, ever the sentinel, followed at his heels. The previous night's discoveries weighed heavily on Martin's mind. The cage, the campsite, the man in the woods, it all painted a grim picture. He couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been lurking on his property wasn't done yet. As Martin walked the perimeter of his land, he spotted fresh footprints near the eastern fence line. His heart sank. The tracks were deliberate, leading directly toward his barn. He quickened his pace, Scout trotting alongside him, ears perked and alert. When Martin reached the barn, he paused, his grip tightening on the shotgun. The large wooden doors were ajar, a stark contrast to the meticulous way he always closed and secured them. He gestured for Scout to stay back, but the dog ignored him, stepping closer with a low growl rumbling in his chest. Pushing the door open, Martin was greeted by a sight that sent a surge of anger through him. Several tools had been knocked over, and feed bags were torn open, their contents strewn across the floor. But what caught his attention most was the makeshift trap, a tripwire set near the entrance, leading to a heavy net concealed in the hay. "Whoever you are," Martin muttered under his breath, "you're not getting away with this." Martin carefully dismantled the trap, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Scout sniffed the area, his nose leading him to a dark corner of the barn. There, partially obscured by hay bales, lay another piece of evidence, a duffel bag stuffed with ropes, gloves, and what appeared to be tranquilizer darts. Martin's blood boiled. This wasn't just a random trespasser. This was someone who had come prepared to take his dogs, or worse. He grabbed the duffel bag and carried it outside, his determination hardening into resolve. Sheriff Daniels arrived shortly after Martin called him. The sheriff's expression darkened as he examined the bag and the disarray in the barn. "This is escalating," Daniels said grimly. "Ties whoever this is, they're organized and dangerous. We'll need to set a trap of our own." Martin nodded, his jaw tight. "I'm not letting them take my dogs, Sheriff. I'll do whatever it takes to keep them safe." Daniels placed a reassuring hand on Martin's shoulder. "We'll catch them, Martin, but you have to let us handle this. I'm assigning deputies to stake out your property tonight. If this guy shows up again, we'll be ready." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the farm became a hub of quiet activity. Deputies set up surveillance equipment around the property, their vehicles hidden in the shadows of the woods. Martin watched from his porch, a mix of anxiety and determination etched on his face. Scout sat beside him, his head resting on Martin's knee, while Daisy and Bailey stayed close, sensing the unease in their usually stoic owner. The waiting was excruciating. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the house made Martin's nerves jangle. He knew the intruder would come back. It was just a matter of when. Around midnight, the stillness was broken by a faint rustling near the barn. The deputies, hidden among the trees, signaled to each other and prepared to move. Martin, unable to sit idle, grabbed his shotgun and stepped outside. Scout was immediately at his side, his ears pricked and his posture tense. Through the dim moonlight, Martin spotted the figure again, the same man from before, now crouched near the barn door. He was fumbling with something, likely setting another trap. Martin's anger flared, but he kept his movements slow and deliberate, signaling for Scout to stay close. The deputies closed in, their footsteps silent. One of them radioed to Sheriff Daniels, who was stationed nearby. As the man attempted to slip inside the barn, the sheriff and his team emerged, flashlights blazing. "Hands in the air!" Daniels shouted, his voice firm and commanding. The man froze for a split second before bolting toward the woods. Martin didn't think twice. He and Scout gave chase, the deputies following close behind. The pursuit was chaotic, the woods alive with the sound of snapping branches and shouts. Scout, faster and more agile than the deputies, closed the gap quickly. He lunged at the man, knocking him off balance. The intruder stumbled and fell, the duffel bag he carried spilling its contents. More traps, ropes, and a map of Martin's property. The deputies caught up and restrained the man, who thrashed and shouted obscenities. Daniels approached, his expression stern as he examined the spilled items. "You've got a lot of explaining to do," the sheriff said, his voice cold. As the deputies hauled the man away, Martin knelt beside Scout, running a hand through his fur. "So good job, boy," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Scout wagged his tail, his eyes bright with pride. Martin stood and watched as the sheriff's team gathered evidence and secured the area. Relief washed over him, but it was tempered by the realization that this ordeal had exposed just how vulnerable his life, and the lives of his dogs, could be. The farmhouse was eerily quiet after the deputies left, the man now in custody. Despite the capture, Martin couldn't shake a lingering unease. The duffel bag and its contents painted a chilling picture. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was premeditated and systematic. Scout, ever vigilant, stayed by his side, as if sensing his unease. Sheriff Daniels had assured Martin that the man would be interrogated, but the sheriff's parting words echoed in Martin's mind. "We may have caught him, but people like this often don't work alone." The thought sent a shiver down Martin's spine. The next day, Martin resolved to make the farm more secure. He spent hours reinforcing fences, installing cameras, and setting up motion-activated lights. Scout, Daisy, and Bailey followed him tirelessly, sensing the importance of his work. Despite the added precautions, Martin couldn't shake the thought of what might have happened if Scout hadn't been there that night. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Martin decided it was time for a rare moment of rest. He settled on the porch with a cup of coffee. Scout curled at his feet, and Bailey and Daisy nestled nearby. The stillness of the night, for the first time in days, felt comforting rather than foreboding. Hours later, the ringing of Martin's phone shattered the calm. Sheriff Daniels' voice was on the other end, his tone sharp and urgent. "Martin, we've got a problem. The man we apprehended last night isn't talking, but we've uncovered enough evidence to suggest he was working with others. Stay vigilant. We'll have more deputies patrolling the area tonight." Martin's grip on the phone tightened. "You think they're coming back?" "It's possible," Daniels admitted, "but don't take any chances. Keep the dogs close and don't hesitate to call us if you see anything suspicious." The weight of the warning settled heavily on Martin. He checked the locks on the doors and windows for the 5th time that evening before settling in the living room. Scout, as always, stayed close. Daisy and Bailey lay near the front door. Their ears perked. The night passed uneventfully, and Martin began to wonder if his paranoia was getting the better of him. But just before dawn, a faint sound outside made him freeze, a rustling near the back of the house. His heart pounded as he grabbed the shotgun and crept toward the window. Through the pale light of the moon, he saw movement near the barn. Another figure, cloaked in darkness, was trying to force open the barn door. Martin's hands tightened on the shotgun. This time, he wasn't waiting for the authorities. He opened the back door silently, signaling for Scout to stay low and follow. Together, they moved toward the barn, their footsteps muffled by the damp ground. As they approached, Martin caught a better glimpse of the intruder, tall and wiry, with a mask obscuring their face. They were carrying something, a cage, small but sturdy. The thought of his dogs being taken filled Martin with a surge of protectiveness. He stepped out of the shadows, aiming the shotgun at the ground as he shouted, "Step away from the barn now." The figure froze for a moment before dropping the cage and making a break for the woods. But Martin was ready. "Scout, go," he commanded. Scout bolted after the intruder, his lean frame cutting through the darkness like a shadow. Martin followed, keeping a steady pace behind. The man stumbled as Scout caught up, snapping at his heels and forcing him to slow. By the time Martin reached them, the man was on the ground, his hands raised in surrender. "You're not going anywhere," Martin growled, keeping the shotgun trained on the intruder as he reached for his phone to call the sheriff. The deputies arrived swiftly, taking the second intruder into custody. Sheriff Daniels, visibly frustrated, paced as he pieced together the situation. "This confirms it," he muttered. "There's a larger network at play here. These dogs, they're not just targets. They're trophies for someone who sees them as a means to an end." Martin's jaw tightened. "Not on my watch," Daniels nodded. "We're going to dig deeper into this. For now, keep doing what you're doing, and we'll step up patrols around your property." As the dawn broke, Martin stood in the barn, Scout at his side. The events of the past few days had changed something in him. The farm had always been his sanctuary, but now it felt like a battleground, a place he would defend at any cost. Scout nudged Martin's hand, his eyes full of quiet understanding. "You've done good, boy," Martin said softly, scratching behind Scout's ears. "Real good." The following days were quieter. With the intruders in custody, the tension around the farm began to ease. Martin continued to make improvements to his property's security, but he also found moments to appreciate the simple joys of life with his dogs. One evening, as he watched Scout, Daisy, and Bailey play in the yard, he realized how much they had come to mean to him. They weren't just animals, they were family, and no one messed with Martin's family. Days turned into weeks, and the shadows of recent events began to dissipate. The intruders were in custody, and Sheriff Daniels informed Martin that the investigation was uncovering a wider network of illegal dog trafficking. Martin's cooperation and Scout's bravery had become central to their efforts. The quiet life on the farm, however, felt different now. It wasn't just a refuge, it was a stronghold. One morning, Martin woke to the sound of Scout barking sharply in the yard. Startled, he threw on his boots and grabbed his jacket, hurrying outside. Scout stood near the gate, tail wagging but alert, barking toward a truck that had pulled up to the driveway. It was Sheriff Daniels. "Morning, Martin," Daniels greeted, stepping out of the vehicle with a warm smile. In his arms he carried a small puppy with floppy ears and a timid expression. Behind him, a deputy followed with a carrier containing 2 more pups. "We thought you'd want to see these." Martin's eyes widened as he approached the sheriff. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. Daniels knelt, placing the puppy gently on the ground. It immediately toddled toward Scout, who sniffed it cautiously before giving a soft woof of approval. "These are some of the dogs we rescued from the operation you helped us crack open," Daniels explained. "They're looking for homes, and I couldn't think of a better one than yours." Martin looked at the puppies in the carrier, then back at Scouty, who seemed to give an approving nod as the puppy licked his nose. For a man who had spent much of his life disliking dogs, the moment felt surreal. "Dietages, I don't know," Martin stammered, running a hand through his hair. "I've already got my hands full with Scout, Daisy, and Bailey." Daniels chuckled. "Well, Scout seems to think you can handle it. Besides, these little ones need someone who understands what they've been through." Martin crouched, letting the tiny puppy climb into his lap. Its soft fur and trusting eyes melted his resolve. "I guess one more couldn't hurt," he murmured, earning an approving bark from Scout. The deputies smiled, placing the other 2 puppies in a secure area of the yard to let them stretch their legs. As the sheriff prepared to leave, he turned back to Martin. "You know, you've done more than just stop a crime ring. You've given these animals a second chance. Not many people would have stepped up like you did." Martin nodded, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "They deserve it," he said simply. "Every one of them." That evening, the farm was alive with the sounds of playful yips and barks. The new puppies explored their surroundings with boundless energy, while Scout, Daisy, and Bailey took turns watching over them. Martin couldn't help but laugh as one of the pups tried to chase a butterfly, tumbling over its own paws in the process. Sitting on the porch, Martin reflected on how much had changed. The man who once saw dogs as nothing more than a nuisance had not only come to love them, but had become their fiercest protector. Scout's arrival had set off a chain of events that reshaped his life and his purpose. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Martin called the dogs over. The puppies scrambled up the porch steps, piling into his lap as Scout and the others settled at his feet. Martin looked at the small, lively pack and felt a profound sense of gratitude. "You saved me as much as I saved you," he said quietly, scratching behind Scout's ears. The loyal dog looked up at him, tail wagging gently, as if to say, "We're in this together." Over the following weeks, Martin's farm became a sanctuary not just for the dogs but for the community. People began to visit, drawn by the story of the farmer and his canine companions. Children came to play with the puppies, neighbors offered help with repairs, and even the sheriff stopped by regularly to check in. The farm, once a solitary retreat, had become a place of connection and healing. One day, as Martin was tending to the garden, he noticed Scout standing by the gate, wagging his tail at a young woman holding a camera. She introduced herself as a journalist working on a story about the rescued dogs and their impact. As she interviewed Martin, she asked, "What do you think made you change your mind about dogs?" Martin paused, looking over at Scout and the others. "They showed me something I'd been missing," he said. "Loyalty, love, and a kind of bravery I didn't know existed. They didn't just change my mind, they changed my life." The story went viral, and Martin's farm became a symbol of hope and redemption. Donations poured in to support the dogs, and offers to adopt the puppies soon followed. But Martin made sure each one went to a home where they would be truly loved and cared for. The puppies left one by one, except for the first one Sheriff Daniels had placed in Martin's arms. That little pup, whom Martin named Chance, had found his forever home. As Martin sat on the porch with Scout by his side and Chance asleep in his lap, he felt a profound sense of peace. The journey had been unexpected, even difficult, but it had been worth every step. "Into second chances," Martin murmured, raising his glass of iced tea as the stars began to twinkle above. Scout woofed softly in agreement, and Chance stretched, nuzzling closer. The farm was quiet once more, but it was a different kind of quiet. one filled with love, loyalty, and the promise of new beginnings. As the weeks rolled by, the farm blossomed into more than just a home. It became a haven for new life and a hub of activity. The story of Martin and his dogs had not only touched hearts within the community, but had also inspired people across the country. Letters poured in from strangers expressing admiration, gratitude, and stories of their own second chances. Martin found himself humbled by the impact Scout, Chances, and the others had made far beyond the boundaries of his farm. One crisp autumn morning, Martin stepped outside with a steaming cup of coffee, looking out over the farm as the rising sun bathed the fields in golden light. Scout, ever vigilant, padded alongside him, tail wagging. Chance, now a bundle of youthful energy, bounded ahead, barking at the rustling leaves as if they were alive. Martin smiled to himself. "I have got the spirit, little guy," he murmured, watching the pup chase an imaginary foe. Scout gave a soft bark of agreement, sitting down beside his human as if to say, "He's one of us now." Life had settled into a new rhythm. Martin continued his work on the farm, but now he had company. Scout following him everywhere like a shadow and Chance constantly underfoot, curious about everything. Bailey and Daisy, ever gentle, kept a watchful eye on the younger dog, their patience infinite. The once solitary existence Martin had embraced felt distant now. His days were filled with purpose, and his evenings were spent surrounded by the quiet, joyful chaos of his four-legged family. He had found something he hadn't even realized he was searching for: connection, companionship, and the simple joy of living. The community, too, had embraced the farm's transformation. What had started as a place to rehome rescued dogs evolved into a small sanctuary. Martin worked with Sheriff Daniels and local volunteers to create a space where animals in need could recover and find new families. The once quiet farm now hosted weekend visits from families and school groups, all eager to meet the dogs and hear their stories. Martin had even started teaching children how to care for animals, showing them the importance of compassion and responsibility. Watching their wide-eyed wonder as they petted Scout or played with Chance filled him with a quiet pride. One evening, as the first stars began to dot the sky, Martin sat on the porch with a journal in hand. He had started writing down his thoughts, a habit encouraged by a kind neighbor who believed it might help him process everything he had experienced. The pages were filled with reflections on the past months, the day Scout came into his life, the harrowing events with the intruders, and the joyous arrival of the puppies. As he wrote, Scout rested his head on Martin's knee, and Chance dozed by his feet, his tiny snores breaking the silence. Martin paused, looking down at his loyal companions. "You two changed everything," he said softly. Scout's tail thumped against the porch, and Chance stirred, yawning before curling up again. The farm's harvest festival, now an annual event, marked the next big milestone. Neighbors and visitors gathered to celebrate not just the season, but the journey of the farm and its dogs. Martin, never one for public speaking, found himself at the center of attention as Sheriff Daniels handed him a microphone. Clearing his throat, Martin looked out at the crowd. "I've never been much for words," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Thomas, but I've learned a lot this past year. These dogs, they taught me about love, loyalty, and second chances. They reminded me that even when life feels empty, there's always room for something new to grow." The audience erupted in applause, and Martin stepped back, handing the microphone to the sheriff with a grateful nod. Scout barked, as if to echo the sentiment, and Chance wagged his tail enthusiastically. As the festival wound down, Martin walked through the crowd, stopping to talk with old friends and new acquaintances. Children ran up to Pet Scout, who accepted their attention with patient dignity, while Chance darted from one person to the next, soaking up every bit of affection. Margaret Tom, the diner owner, approached Martin with a plate of her famous apple pie. "You've done something amazing here," she said, her eyes warm with admiration. "The town's better because of it and because of you." Martin shook his head, smiling. "It's not just me," he replied. "It's all of us. This farm, these dogs, they've brought us together." As the last of the guests departed, Martin stood on the porch, looking out over the now quiet farm. The lanterns strung around the barn cast a soft glow, and the cool night air carried the faint scent of hay and apples. Scout sat beside him, his gaze fixed on the horizon, while Chance lay sprawled on the porch steps, his little body rising and falling with each breath. For a man who didn't like dogs, Martin said aloud, his voice tinged with amusement, I sure can't imagine life without them now. Scout leaned against him, and Martin reached down to scratch behind his ears. Here's to you, boy, he said softly, and to all the second chances we never see coming. The story of Martin and his dogs became a beacon of hope for those who heard it, a reminder that even the most unexpected moments can lead to profound change. And while the farm continued to flourish, it remained at its heart, a testament to the unbreakable bond between a man and his dogs. If you were inspired by this incredible journey, share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to never miss more heartwarming stories like this one. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.